Imagine waking up to the deafening grind of concrete mixers tearing apart a creek that's flowed behind your home for generations. Diesel fumes mix with the scent of pulverized limestone, choking the morning air, while tens of thousands of dollars in homeowner fees vanish into what used to be a sparkling mountain stream. It's for flood control, HOA President Brenda Hartwell declares smugly from behind the wheel of her white Tesla. She didn't realize I had a background in Army Corps hydrology and that her pet project had just set a disaster in motion. Months later, her $1 million home sat under 2 feet of swamp water, foundation cracking, while mine remained perfectly dry. The FBI was at her door, and the concrete channel she was so proud of was about to drain her financially. What would you do if your hoe burned through your money to destroy your peace? My name is Robert, and I once thought my biggest worry was finding parts for a 1972 Harley Sportster. I was wrong. The real danger came in the form of a power-hungry HOA president who mistook a real estate license for an engineering degree. I live on 2 acres of land in what used to be rural Colorado, back when home meant herd of Angus instead of homeowners association. My grandfather, William Brennan, a decorated combat engineer from WI, returned home to build this place by hand. The creek behind our house was his sanctuary, and it became mine too. A coffee on the porch every morning, listening to Cottonwood Creek tumble over granite, the scent of willow bark in the air, and the crunch of gravel paths my grandfather laid in 1948 underfoot. My wife, Martha, has been teaching 4th graders for over 2 decades and has the patience of a saint, to something she'd need for what was coming. Our children are grown and scattered, but they inherited my grandfather's stubbornness. What truly makes this land special isn't the old ranch house or my cluttered workshop full of vintage motorcycle parts, it's the 400 yards of creek flowing through it, with water rights older than the state of Colorado itself. Then came Willowbrook Estates, sprouting like overpriced mushrooms after rain. 47 luxury homes, most occupied by California transplants fleeing their own HOA nightmares. Leading them was Brenda Hartwell, a HOA president, self-proclaimed queen of suburban perfection, and the perfect mix of arrogance and ignorance. White Tesla, vanity plates reading "sold for you," pearl earrings like battle armor, and an investment banker husband who rarely set foot outside Denver. Their pristine lawn ended where my wild creek began. Her first move, a formal HOA violation notice accusing me of unsightly storage of motorcycle parts, threatening $200 a day in fines. What her attorneys failed to realize was that my property predated their HOA by nearly a century and was legally exempt from their covenants. I reminded her of this in writing. She responded with petty revenge anonymous complaints to the county accusing me of running an illegal business. A building inspector combed through my shop for hours, found nothing but clutter, yet it still cost me over $1,000 in legal defense. That was just her opening act. The real attack came when she learned about my water rights. In Colorado, water means control, and Brenda wasn't about to let someone with calloused hands keep either. She hired a Denver law firm notorious for twisting environmental laws to target property owners. Their tactic? File a nuisance water flow complaint, claiming my land was causing dangerous runoff that threatened $1 million homes downstream. The legal packet landed on my doorstep like a brick, dozens of pages of jargon designed to intimidate. But I knew one thing. This was no longer a neighborly dispute. This was war. In plain terms, their strategy was simply make the old guy prove that his 150-year-old creek wouldn't flood their oversized luxury homes. The plan was to corner me into paying for a $50,000 environmental impact study, the kind that drags on for years and requires hiring the same consultants who likely play golf with their attorneys on Saturdays. That evening, Martha found me standing knee-deep in the creek, boots sinking into the muddy bank as I measured water flow with my grandfather's worn surveyor's rod. "What's going through your head?" she asked in that careful, no-nonsense tone she uses on 4th graders who are about to make a bad decision. I told her Brenda's legal team had just made a $50,000 mistake and they'd chosen the wrong retired engineer to pick a fight with. See, after 3 decades with the Army Corps of Engineers, I know exactly how much lawyers rely on environmental rules to confuse people. They assume the average property owner will get lost in the jargon, What they overlooked is that some of us actually built the systems they're trying to weaponize. It's like having someone explain your own engine design to you, thinking you'll be impressed. I called my old friend Pete Morrison at the Colorado Water Authority. Within minutes, he spotted the glaring flaw in their argument if they'd based their complaint on watershed maps from 1967. That was before the interstate existed, before half the upstream subdivisions were built, and before modern drainage systems reshaped every flow pattern in the valley. Pete laughed and offered to send me the updated surveys. "This is going to sting for them," he said. The new geological data flipped their case upside down. Far from creating a flood hazard, my section of the creek actually reduced flooding by naturally holding runoff during spring melt. Those granite boulders my grandfather placed decades ago weren't for looks if they were part of an old-school flood control design, built before most people even knew what that meant. Then came the real legal knockout. In Colorado, water law follows the prior appropriation doctrine first in time, first in right. My family's documented water usage dated back to 1873, which meant our claim outranked every single water right filed afterward, including anything tied to Brenda's HOA. I spent the weekend in my workshop surrounded by my grandfather's meticulous engineering notes and the latest county maps, piecing together evidence they never saw coming. The air smelled of motor oil and aged paper, and with each pencil stroke on graph paper, I felt like I was channeling the old man himself. By Monday, I was ready. I didn't just file a defense, I launched a counterattack. My complaint demanded the HOA pay for a proper environmental assessment, since their lawsuit relied on outdated, misleading data. I attached Pete's report showing their development actually increased downstream flood risks. The county water commissioner, Rodriguez, looked over my packet and laughed outright. They tried to school a hydrologist about water flow using maps from the Johnson era? This might set a record for fastest dismissal, he said. 2 weeks later, the verdict was in. I'd won completely. The HOA was ordered to end all water-related harassment, and my historical water rights were formally recognized in writing. My claim wasn't just protected, it was etched into the legal record. The victory had an unexpected ripple effect. The local paper ran a story titled "HOA Challenges Century-Old Water Rights, Loses Spectacularly." Soon, neighbors I'd never spoken to began showing up with their own Brenda nightmares of fines for non-standard mailboxes, penalties over garden copyright core, even threats about exterior paint colors. That evening, I stood by the creek at sunset, my grandfather's fishing rod in hand, not intending to catch anything. This is where he taught me about water. I told Martha, it always takes the easiest path, but it never stops moving toward where it belongs. And where does this water belong? She asked. I smiled, listening to Cottonwood Creek run over stones older than Brenda's entire family line, flowing straight through the heart of her carefully curated neighborhood. But if you think losing that case humbled her, you'd be mistaken. Brenda must have been a graduate of the Double Down on Bad Ideas Academy, because her next stunt was so bold it was almost admirably in the same way you'd admire someone who jumps off a cliff shouting about their constitutional right to fly. Not long after the county told her to back off, she called an emergency HOA board meeting. She timed it perfectly right when Martha and I were finally taking a trip to visit our daughter Jessica, our first real getaway since the whole mess began. The meeting notice was sent to an address we hadn't lived at in years, conveniently ensuring we'd never see it in time to intervene. On paper, the agenda looked harmless: emergency flood mitigation assessment. In reality, Brenda came armed with doctored photographs showing what she claimed was severe erosion threatening HOA property. The images looked suspiciously like someone had taken a backhoe to the creek bank just to create damage. Her engineering consultant turned out to be nothing more than her cousin's landscaping guy, who naturally concluded that the only way to save the neighborhood was immediate concrete channeling. The vote passed 6-1, with only Edwin Kowalski dissenting. Edwin called me that night, his accent thick with outrage. She says flood will destroy everything if we don't put concrete in your creek. She has pictures, but this smells bad, like fish left in the sun. He told me about the special assessment of $1,800 from every homeowner for a $127,000 project no competent engineer would have deemed necessary. But Brenda had found her magic hammer, and suddenly every problem looked like something that needed to be nailed down with concrete. We cut the trip short. I drove through the night, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, calculating just how much destruction could be done before I got home. The answer: plenty. The noise hit first the jackhammers and diesel engines replacing the morning bird calls. Then came the smell of cement dust mixed with shredded vegetation and diesel exhaust hanging in the valley like industrial smog. I turned into my driveway and froze. My creek was gone. In its place was a slab-sided concrete channel, ugly and lifeless, the kind of thing you'd expect behind a prison or in an abandoned industrial park. The crystal water that once danced over smooth granite now crept through a gray gutter barely a foot and a half deep. My grandfather's carefully placed boulder gone. The fish spawning beds that had survived longer than Colorado had been a state now buried under tons of cement. Martha stood beside me, eyes wet. "They killed it," she whispered. "They actually killed a living creek. But here's the thing about spending 30 years in hydrology: you learn to think like water, and water, no matter how obstructed, always finds its truth." I began documenting everything. Photographs from every angle, flow rate measurements, water samples for chemical testing. Then I dug into Pinnacle Construction, the outfit responsible for the work. The record was telling of 3 EPA violations in 5 years. $75,000 in fines for unauthorized waterway alterations, and a habit of breaking ground before permits were issued. That's the part most property owners don't realize: major changes to a natural waterway require clearance from 3 levels of authority: the county, the state environmental agency, and often the EPA itself. Skip even one, and you're in deep trouble. Brenda's crew had skipped all 3. The Clean Water Act doesn't play around. Federal penalties alone can hit $25,000 per day for unapproved concrete work in fish habitats. Add in Colorado's own environmental fines, and you're looking at another $10,000 per day. That's $35,000 in potential penalties for every single day that concrete remained in my creek. I filed formal complaints with every relevant authority: county enforcement, the state environmental office, and the EPA's Denver division. Then I called the president of the local Trout Unlimited chapter. When I told him about the destruction of the spawning grounds, he nearly exploded. "This is exactly the kind of habitat loss we've been fighting for decades. We'll back you in every way: legal, financial, expert testimony." They just picked a fight with every trout fisherman in Colorado. The response was immediate and coordinated. Within days, 3 separate government agencies had opened investigations. On top of that, the Environmental Law Clinic at the University of Colorado reached out, offering free legal representation. I had enough evidence to bury Pete and Associates under their own paperwork, but Brenda wasn't done swinging. Edwin Kowalski warned me she was already plotting her next escalation: a full-scale flood control system that would turn the creek into a solid concrete chute from the county road to the subdivision boundary. Her logic: if we're going to do it, we might as well do it completely. That night, I sat in my workshop surrounded by my grandfather's engineering notebooks, flipping through his black and white photos of the creek in its natural form. The old combat engineer had created something functional and beautiful that had stood for 7 decades without a single flood. Brenda destroyed it in 3 days, but in doing so, she'd racked up enough environmental violations to hang herself in court. If desperation has a scent, it's vanilla candles mixed with nervous sweat in a real estate office at sunrise. That's exactly what I walked into a few weeks later, sitting across from Brenda Hardwell as she tried to sell me on a fantasy where concrete was natural. "Dale," she began, sliding a manila envelope across the desk, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. This has all been a broken bar. Unfortunate." Inside was a cashier's check for $500,000 and a non-disclosure agreement as thick as my grandfather's engineering manual. The offer was blunt and illegal: take the money, keep quiet about the creek, leave the county within 6 months, and hand over my water rights to the HOA for proper management. The threat wasn't subtle: lawsuits are expensive, Dale. Even when you win, you lose. Think about Martha's job. I'd come prepared. Colorado allows single-party consent for recordings, and my digital recorder was rolling when she added, "If you refuse, I'll make sure every property owner here sees you as an anti-development extremist tanking property values. I have deep real estate connections, and your wife's teaching career could get a broken bar complicated." That same week, my workshop was vandalized again. This time, they didn't bother hiding a vintage motorcycle parts scattered across the floor, tools stolen, my restored '72 Sportster knocked over with sugar poured in the gas tank. But their mistake was bigger. My new security cameras caught everything, including a clear shot of a white Tesla idling at the end of my driveway at 2 in the morning. The harassment turned relentless. Anonymous one-star reviews hit Martha's after-school tutoring program, branding her unprofessional and politically radical. Someone even called her principal with concerns about her fitness to teach. Martha was losing sleep. I was checking my blood pressure twice a day. But Brenda misunderstood something about engineers HOA document. Every threat, every bit of vandalism, every bogus complaint went into a growing case file, each entry logged with the precision of a federal investigation, which was fitting, because that's exactly what it was becoming. The EPA had opened a formal case. The Colorado Attorney General's office sent investigators. Environmental groups were treating this like the suburban equivalent of the Exxon Valdez disaster. And with every step, I was gaining allies faster than Brenda was making enemies. One of those allies was Sarah Olivia, a third-year environmental law student who took my case as her senior thesis. While combing through HOA financial records, she found something I'd only suspected: a pattern of bloated contracts linked to companies inside Brenda's real estate circle. "Mr. Brennan," she said, spreading the paperwork across my workshop table, "this so-called flood project cost $127,000. Based on the scope of work, it should have been $40,000 tops. The extra winter consulting fees and emergency contractor premiums are paid to businesses owned by Brenda's associates." Where I'd seen smoke, Sarah found fiery secret board meetings, no competitive bidding, special assessments funding personal vendettas. What began as environmental vandalism was starting to look like organized fraud. Then came the find that changed everything. While reviewing my grandfather's notes, I uncovered his 1973 consulting report for the county, a document that predicted exactly what was unfolding. He had warned against concrete channeling in this exact spot, calculating it would raise downstream flood risk by 300% during spring runoff. The report was loaded with flowcharts, seasonal water data, and soil absorption studies, everything Brenda's so-called consultant had ignored. It proved that a qualified engineer had already studied this creek half a century ago and reached the opposite conclusion from Brenda's landscaper. That's when it hit me, the delicious irony. Brenda thought she was solving a flood issue, but she had built a hydraulic time bomb. The natural creek had meandered through my land, spreading runoff across a wide floodplain that absorbed water like a sponge. The concrete channel she'd poured would do the opposite, funneling every gallon of spring snow melt straight toward the HOA's $1 million foundations. The concrete channel had completely removed the creek's natural ability to absorb water, effectively turning it into a pressurized cannon aimed straight at $1 million basement. That weekend, I sat down with my grandfather's old engineering diagrams, my calculator, and updated weather reports. The numbers were both terrifying and oddly satisfying. When the spring thaw came and all forecasts agreed it would be a heavy one, Brenda's solution would transform what should have been a controlled, harmless stream into a raging torrent capable of tearing apart foundations. My property, sitting higher and upstream, would remain perfectly dry, but the HOA homes downstream, they'd flood faster than a boat with a hole in its hull. On Sunday evening, Edwin Kowalski stopped by while I was sketching out potential restoration plans at my kitchen table. "Dale," he said gravely, "this woman Brenda broken bar, she make very big mistake." I nodded toward the weather predictions, which showed record snowpack and a wet spring, then toward my grandfather's precise calculations proving exactly what would happen when poor planning collided with the laws of nature. "Edwin," I told him, "she's just built herself the most expensive lawsuit imaginable. The creek is going to take its revenge with interest." A few weeks later, on a dull February morning, Sarah Olivia showed up at my workshop carrying a banker's box and the kind of look that suggested someone's day was about to be ruined. Thankfully, not mine. "Mr. Brennan," she said, dropping the box onto my workbench with a satisfying thud. "You'll want to sit down for this." For the past 3 weeks, Sarah had been doing what she called forensic accounting on the HOA's books, essentially tracking every cent like a bloodhound on the scent. What she uncovered would have made federal investigators cheer. The infamous concrete project had cost homeowners $127,000, yet the actual work was worth maybe $40,000. The remaining $87,000, gone siphoned away through inflated consulting invoices, emergency contractor surcharges, and environmental assessment fees, all funneled into companies with suspiciously familiar names: Hardwell Property Consulting, Willowbrook Environmental Solutions. Brenda wasn't just wrecking my creek, she was looting her own neighborhood. But that was only the opening act. 20 minutes later, Edwin returned, clutching a small digital recorder as if it were a holy relic. "Dale," he began, his Polish accent thick with restrained fury, "remember I told you I vote against concrete project. I maybe forget to mention a broken bar I record whole meeting." The recording was damning. Brenda's voice came through crisp and clear, laying out that the real purpose wasn't flood prevention at all, and it was about forcing out incompatible residents who didn't fit her vision for the community. She openly discussed using HOA funds to drag me into costly legal disputes, banking on the idea most people couldn't afford to fight back. Then came the kicker: her confession that the concrete channel wasn't to stop floods, but to erase any hint of the area's ranching past so she could boost property values for her real estate ventures. The final, most devastating piece of evidence came from my grandfather's old files. While sorting through them for the case, I found a folder labeled, "Willowbrook Development Consultation A 1973. Inside was a full hydrological study he'd done for the county, warning against concrete channeling in that exact location. His projections were uncannily accurate. Removing the creek's natural flood absorption would send all spring runoff directly toward the downstream neighborhood. In heavy snowmelt years exactly like the one ahead, the result would be catastrophic flooding for any homes built in the natural floodplain. And, as fate would have it, Brenda's house sat squarely in that danger zone. My property, by contrast, sat safely above it. He had even recommended not developing there at all, advice the 1990s builders ignored. His notes were almost prophetic. "The creek will reclaim its floodplain eventually. Concrete will only make it angrier when it does." Sarah spread her financial evidence across my workbench while I unfolded my grandfather's detailed maps and calculations. The story they told was crystal clear. Brenda had stolen nearly $90,000 from her neighbors to fund a project that would destroy their homes while leaving mine untouched. "This isn't just fraud," Sarah said as she sorted documents into neat legal stacks. "It's conspiracy, environmental sabotage, and maybe even racketeering, and the EPA violations alone could send her straight to federal prison." When we added the financial crimes to the list, it became clear she was staring down some serious prison time. Martha stopped by for coffee, poring over the evidence with a teacher's knack for spotting patterns. She set herself up, Martha murmured. Every move Brenda made to harm us had only generated more proof against her. Outside, the February snow was vanishing faster than normal, and Cottonwood Creek was surging in its concrete confines. Forecasts warned this year's spring runoff could be the biggest in 2 decades. Brenda had essentially built herself a time bomb, and then handed me everything I needed to convict her once it went off. My only dilemma was whether to warn her neighbors of the danger or let the physics foreseen by my grandfather's engineering half a century ago deliver the lesson. My garage had shifted from a motorcycle restoration shop into what looked like a war room designed by engineers who watched too many spy thrillers. Every surface was crowded with maps, legal filings, financial statements, and my grandfather's blueprints. The coffee pot never cooled. The landline rang non-stop. Martha began arriving with sandwich trays to feed the steady stream of allies coming through the door. In the corner, my freshly restored 1972 Harley Sportster stood gleaming, a symbol of breathing life back into the broken, fitting for our mission to repair the creek. Kate Morrison, an environmental lawyer from the University of Colorado's legal clinic, had officially taken my case without charge after reviewing Sarah's financial evidence. Kate was the type who'd rather take down polluters than chase personal injury claims, and she strategized like a grandmaster with a personal vendetta. "Dale," she said, laying out a master timeline on my workbench, "we're not just fighting one case, we've got 4, and we'll win every single one." Her plan was brilliantly layered: federal case, Clean Water Act violations and illegal habitat destruction; state case, water rights theft and falsified environmental permits; county case, building code breaches and improper special assessments; civil case, fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and deliberate emotional harm. Each front bolstered the others like overlapping arcs of fire. Even if Brenda somehow slipped through one net, the other 3 would crush her. Thanks to the private attorney general rule, we could recover every dollar in legal fees if we prevailed. Environmental law actually encourages citizens to sue when government regulators can't keep up. Sarah's financial probe had turned into something both elegant and devastating. She brought in 2 law students and a forensic accounting professor who treated HOA fraud like a Sudoku puzzle. They traced Brenda's inflated contract scheme back 3 years to landscaping, security systems, legal consulting. Every penny funneled through her business web. The estimated theft, over $200,000 from homeowner dues. That wasn't just civil fraud, it was federal racketeering, the kind of crime that comes with multi-year prison sentences. Meanwhile, I was sketching the creek's restoration plan, combining my grandfather's 50-year-old surveys with modern eco-engineering. The natural channel design would curb flooding and revive fish habitat for about $35,000, less than half what Brenda wasted on her concrete catastrophe. Colorado Trout Unlimited pledged $25,000. The Sierra Club tossed in another $15,000. Local fishing groups, environmentalists, and even a few remorseful home members contributed to what was now called the Cottonwood Creek Redemption Project. Community energy surged. My workshop became a weekly gathering spot for 30 to 40 people, including veterans who respected seeing a combat engineer's grandson fight bureaucratic nonsense. Martha ran the social media push. #Save Cottonwood Creek had over 5,000 followers and growing. Dr. Angela Rodriguez from Colorado State's Environmental Engineering Department volunteered as our expert witness. After running modern computer simulations alongside my grandfather's 1973 calculations, she concluded the concrete channel boosted flood risk by 400% during peak runoff, forcing water straight into home foundations. "Your grandfather was ahead of his time by decades," she told me, pointing to his hand-drawn diagrams. "This is how we design natural flood control today." Brenda hadn't just damaged a creek, she'd dismantled a sophisticated flood defense system that had safeguarded the valley for generations. Kate coordinated the media approach, making sure coverage stayed focused on environmental protection, not personal grudges. The David versus Goliath narrative caught on with local journalists, and soon the story was spreading beyond Colorado, turning up on environmental law blogs, in fishing magazines, and even attracting a Denver public television documentary crew. The real trump card was still grandfather's archival proof. His photographs from the 1950s showed how the natural creek had managed decades of spring floods without ever damaging property. In court, those images would be devastating, a clear evidence that it was the concrete, not nature, that had created the flood risk. Weather reports painted a grim picture: heavy snowpack in the Rockies, an unusually warm spring ahead, and several storm systems aimed directly at peak snowmelt season. The concrete channel was about to face its first true trial, and it was going to fail, and fail spectacularly. Meanwhile, Edwin Kowalski had become our quiet source inside the HOA, reporting on the growing panic during board meetings. Members were beginning to fear legal consequences. 3 had already resigned, claiming they'd been misled about the legality of the project. The pressure was building fast. Federal investigators had launched an official probe. The county's district attorney had opened a criminal case into the HOA's financial dealings. The state environmental agency issued an emergency halt order. Across Colorado, multiple class action lawsuits were being filed by other HOA victims. In the evenings, Martha and I would walk along the ruined stretch of creek, imagining its revival. The water fought against the concrete barriers, the air still heavy with the sterile scent of curing cement. It was ugly now, but only for the moment. "How long before it's alive again?" Martha asked. I ran through mental calculations of seasonal floods, legal hurdles, and rebuilding schedules. "By next spring, it'll be more beautiful than grandfather ever dreamed," I told her. "If we can make it through this spring first." Desperation has its own scent, a mix of cloying air freshener, sweat from fear, and the acrid tang of burned bridges. That was exactly what filled Brenda's real estate office when she called me in for an early morning emergency meeting that felt more like a hostage negotiation. She slid a sealed envelope across her glass desk. "I've been thinking about our situation. Maybe we can work out a deal." Inside was a cashier's check for $750,000 and a gag order that would have made the CIA jealous. Her terms were simple: take the money, leave Colorado, sign my water rights over to an HOA-controlled trust, and never speak publicly about creek restoration, environmental law, or HOA governance again. The threat was barely disguised. "Lawsuits ruin families, Dale," she said. "Ask Martha how her teaching job would hold up if the school board thought her husband was some kind of radical environmental activist." I brought my digital recorder again, a perfectly legal hearing, and captured her next words, which were pure gold for any prosecutor. "If you don't take this final offer, I'll make sure every contractor, supplier, and business owner in this valley knows you're the kind of troublemaker who costs people money. Your wife's tutoring business, your motorcycle hobby, your good naming are gone. I have connections you wouldn't believe." That night, my workshop was hit again. This time, they weren't just stealing it, they were sending a message. My fully restored Harley was tipped over, the frame bent beyond repair, 40 hours of work gone in minutes. Grandfather's original engineering notebooks lay scattered across the floor, pages torn or soaked in motor oil. But they made a fatal mistake. The upgraded security system I'd installed after the first break-in caught everything in high-definition color. 2 figures in hoodies systematically destroying my property, followed by a white Tesla with unforgettable vanity plates picking them up. One of the vandals wore $300 sneakers I'd seen on Brenda's teenage son. From there, the attacks turned psychological. Fake negative reviews flooded Martha's tutoring business, claims of unprofessional conduct, political indoctrination, and unsafe conditions for children. Someone created phony social media accounts to smear me, alleging I'd been dishonorably discharged from the military for mental instability and aggression toward authority. The school principal summoned Martha for a concerned meeting over complaints about her husband's erratic behavior. 3 parents canceled tutoring sessions after receiving anonymous letters warning them about a supposed political extremist teaching their kids. What Brenda never understood about engineers is that we document everything. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every anonymous mail were carefully cataloged, indexed, and backed up. And those files? They ended up exactly where they needed to be, on the desks of federal investigators. Agent Lisa Park from the FBI's white-collar crime unit was now pursuing the HOA's financial fraud. Agent Tom Rodriguez from the EPA's Criminal Enforcement Division was building the environmental crimes case. The forensic accountants had traced a clear trail to nearly $200,000 siphoned from the homeowners' funds. The findings were starting to crack Brenda's composure. According to Edwin Kowalski, she had erupted into shouting matches with 3 fellow board members during their last meeting, accusing them of betraying the community's vision simply because they questioned her mounting legal bills. 2 more members promptly resigned, leaving only Brenda and a single loyal ally to preside over a subdivision spiraling into legal chaos. Meanwhile, the early arrival of warm weather had the snow melting at an alarming pace. Temperatures were running far above normal, and flood watches had been posted across the Front Range. Cottonwood Creek was already flowing at 1.5 times its usual seasonal volume, and the heaviest melt was still weeks away. Each evening, I waded into the creek with my grandfather's old surveyor's rod, measuring the surging current and noting how the concrete channel handled the extra water. The results were exactly as my grandfather's designs had foreseen. Rather than allowing the water to disperse naturally across the floodplain, the concrete funneled every drop into a narrow, high-pressure torrent aimed squarely at the HOA's homes. Dr. Rodriguez at Colorado State had even run computer models showing that at peak flood, The velocity could compromise the stability of house foundations. Insurance companies had begun asking awkward questions about unauthorized drainage alterations or changes that could void flood coverage altogether. Community backing was stronger than I ever imagined. Local businesses hung signs in my support. The high school environmental club adopted creek restoration as their senior project. Veterans groups treated it like defending one of their own. Regional fishing and environmental organizations rallied, turning the fight into a symbol of grassroots pushback against HOA overreach. But Brenda was still escalating. Edwin warned me she was planning something reckless for the next board meeting, possibly bringing in private security to guard HOA property or trying to get a restraining order by portraying me as a threat. That night, Martha found me in my workshop, poring over snowpack charts, channel flow data, and my grandfather's old flood projections by lamplight. "How bad is it going to get?" she asked. I studied the maps that showed exactly where all that pressurized water would go. "Bad enough to settle this for good," I said. Then came the call that changed everything. Edwin's voice was a low whisper, like he was leaking classified intel. "Dale, you should know Brenda's loading a moving truck. Big one. Middle of the night. Looks shady." I threw on clothes and drove past her house as the first sunlight hit the mountains. Sure enough, a commercial moving truck sat in her driveway. Brenda was directing movers as they loaded expensive furniture, her Tesla already stuffed with personal belongings. The same woman who had tried for months to drive me out was apparently staging her own retreat. But not before one last stunt of something halfway between cunning and madness. Sarah Olivia called soon after, her voice tight. "Mr. Robert, Brenda just filed for an emergency restraining order against HOA, claims you've been stalking her family and making terrorist threats against HOA property. She's even asking for federal protection under anti-domestic terrorism laws." The paperwork was a work of fiction worthy of an award. According to her sworn statement, I was a disgruntled military veteran with documented anger problems, conducting surveillance on HOA families and plotting to sabotage community infrastructure. She even included photos of me measuring creek flow, presenting them as proof of my surveillance activities. Evidence began piling up that Brenda had been conducting suspicious reconnaissance. Her restraining order hearing was set for the exact day Peak Springs snowmelt would crest, a timing that was either pure coincidence or a clear sign she knew exactly how dear her situation had become. That afternoon unfolded with the precision of a military operation. If military operations included environmental attorneys, forensic accountants, and furious fish biologists. Kate Morrison arrived armed with a legal brief so thick it could stop a bullet, while Dr. Rodriguez brought real-time flood modeling data that painted a grim picture. "Dale," Kate said, spreading documents across my kitchen table, "she's trying to stall the courts until after flood season. If she gets a restraining order keeping you away from the creek during peak flooding, no one will be there to document what happens to those homes." The National Weather Service had just upgraded to a flash flood warning. Snowpack in the mountains was melting faster than expected, and multiple storm systems were lining up to hit Colorado at the worst possible time. Cottonwood Creek was already running at twice its normal flow, and the true peak was still days away. But Brenda had made a fatal mistake. The restraining order forced her to appear in federal court and testify under oath, meaning she would have to explain her surveillance claims while prosecutors held recordings of her offering bribes and threatening witnesses. FBI agent Park had been quietly tracking her for weeks, following the money trail through her business network like a bloodhound with a federal badge. The embezzlement case was airtight. Nearly $200,000 siphoned from homeowner dues through fraudulent contracts and kickbacks. Add witness intimidation, bribery, and environmental crimes, and Brenda was staring down serious federal prison time. The night before the hearing, I sat in my workshop, cleaning my grandfather's service revolver, not because I expected a confrontation, but because certain rituals help clear the mind. Outside, the creek was roaring, spring runoff transforming the concrete channel into a high-pressure water cannon aimed at million-dollar foundations. Martha found me at midnight, bent over flood prediction charts by lamplight. "Tomorrow changes everything, doesn't it?" she asked. "One way or another," I replied. listening to the water fight against its concrete prison. Either the legal system works broken bar or physics delivers the lesson. Media attention was now at a fever pitch, at the kind usually reserved for political scandals or natural disasters. Denver news crews were planning live coverage of both the court hearing and the flood. Environmental law blogs had made my case a rallying cry for citizens fighting corporate-style HOA abuse. The #concrete versus nature was trending nationwide. Saran uncovered proof that Brenda's family had already bought a home in Florida, a clear evidence of premeditated flight. Bank records showed liquidated investments, closed accounts, and money transfers designed to hide assets from legal judgments. She was, essentially, fleeing the state while accusing me of being a terrorist. That evening, Edwin stopped by with word from the final HOA board meeting. Only Brenda and one loyal holdout showed up, while angry homeowners demanded answers about flood insurance, legal exposure, and warranty claims. Several families had already sued over unauthorized modifications that voided their coverage. Dale, Edwin said, she has made herself the enemy of everyone, even those who voted for the concrete project. See, now she lied to them. The irony was perfect. After months of trying to turn the neighborhood against me, Brenda's greed had managed to unite them in opposition to her. She was now utterly isolated, abandoned even by her former allies. Tomorrow, a federal court would decide whether environmental law could protect citizens from HOA overreach. But spring floods don't wait for verdicts. Physics was about to issue its own ruling on concrete versus nature, and physics has never lost a case. The Denver federal courthouse was packed wall to wall, with overflow crowds watching a live stream in the lobby while reporters scrambled for camera space outside. Presiding over the so-called Creek War trial was Judge Martha Blackwood, no relation to me, but a jurist whose reputation for enforcing environmental law was enough to make corporate attorneys break into a sweat. The gallery was split between environmental activists, veterans groups, and local families fighting their own HOA battles. Outside, Cottonwood Creek surged toward dangerous levels. Inside, Brenda Hartwell was about to find out that Carmel Crew's interest. Kate Morrison's opening statement was sharp and deliberate. Your Honor, this case is about the calculated destruction of a century-old ecosystem to satisfy one woman's personal vendetta against a neighbor who refused to submit to her authority. The defendant didn't just break environmental laws, she stole nearly $200,000 from her own community to make it happen. Brenda's attorney, a jittery young associate from Peyton Associates, tried to paint me as a radical environmentalist standing in the way of progress. His voice cracked when he argued the concrete channel was a necessary flood control measure approved by experts. Then Kate played the recordings. The room fell silent as Brenda's voice echoed through the speakers, offering bribes and threatening Martha's career. Gasps rippled through the audience when a secret home meeting recording revealed her true plan: pushing out undesirable residents to boost property values for her real estate ventures. Your Honor, Kate said, the defendant's own words prove this was never about flood control. This was about weaponizing HOA authority to carry out economic and demographic cleansing. My testimony was simple and direct. I drew on 3 decades of flood control experience, explaining the dangers in plain language. I presented my grandfather's 1973 engineering report, which predicted exactly what would happen when natural flood absorption was replaced with concrete. Computer models illustrated how the channel forced water directly toward vulnerable foundations. The hose project had been forcing up to 4 times more water toward neighborhood homes during peak flow. But the real turning point came when Dr. Rodriguez presented live flood monitoring data. As we sat in court, the creek's flow was nearing record highs, and the concrete channel was behaving exactly as my grandfather had predicted, like a high-pressure fire hose blasting straight at million-dollar basements. Your Honor, Dr. Rodriguez testified, this concrete installation poses an immediate threat to public safety. Right now, during peak flood conditions, the water velocity in that channel is strong enough to undermine a building's foundation. The judge called for a recess just as the National Weather Service issued a flash flood emergency. Court officers evacuated the lower level of the courthouse, while emergency crews raced to respond to flooding reports across the valley. When we returned, Brenda looked like she'd seen a ghost. Her attorney was glued to his phone, no doubt tracking the chaos she'd caused. That's when Kate delivered the knockout line. Your Honor, while we've been in session, the defendant's concrete channel has started flooding the very homes it was meant to protect. Emergency crews are pumping water from basements in Willowbrook Estates, while Mr. Brennan's higher elevated property upstream remains completely dry. News helicopters confirmed the water was backing up behind Brenda's concrete choke point, causing the exact basement flooding my grandfather's design had prevented for 70 years. $1-million homes sat in murky pools while my workshop on higher ground stayed bone dry. Brenda's meltdown was caught on every camera in the room. She accused me of causing the flood, claimed environmentalists had somehow weaponized the weather, and demanded federal protection from what she called my eco-terrorist conspiracy. Judge Blackwood's patience wore thin. Miss Hartwell, control yourself or face contempt charges. This court has heard enough. By lunch, FBI agents had served new warrants, seizing financial records tied to the racketeering investigation. EPA officers were securing the concrete work sites as active crime scenes. State investigators arrived with proof of widespread HOA fraud across multiple developments. The afternoon session was almost a formality. Judge Blackwood ruled in my favor on every count of Clean Water Act violations, water rights infringement, fraud, conspiracy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She ordered the immediate removal of all concrete, full creek restoration, and $750,000 in damages, including legal fees and punitive awards. Most importantly, her ruling set a legal precedent protecting water rights from HOA abuse, giving other homeowners a framework to fight back. Outside, the press conference felt like a victory parade. Environmental lawyers called it a landmark case. Veterans groups gave me a community service award. Local students handed Martha thank you cards they'd drawn themselves. But the truest victory came later that evening, as emergency crews pumped water from Brenda's basement and contractors prepared to free my grandfather's creek. Martha and I stood on our back porch, listening to water flow where it belonged. "Justice sounds like running water," she said. For the first time in months, that sound was free again. 6 months later, Cottonwood Creek was unrecognizable. Where once ugly concrete trapped its flow, a winding natural channel now danced between banks lined with native willows and wildflowers. Each morning, I woke not to the harsh scrape of water against concrete, but to the gentle murmur of a living creek. The restoration became a community project worthy of my grandfather's pride. Contractors donated machinery and labor. High school students planted native plants for their biology class. Even some remorseful former home members showed up with shovels and checkbooks. The air now carried the scent of fresh earth and cold mountain water instead of concrete dust and diesel fumes. In the evenings, Martha and I would walk the banks, watching native trout return to spawn in gravel beds long buried. Children fished in spots once marred by concrete scars. It was better than my grandfather could have dreamed of because it wasn't just his vision anymore. It had been reborn through the hands and hearts of the entire community, its impact spreading outward like ripples in still water. Colorado's legislature later enacted what environmental advocates quickly dubbed Dale's Law, a measure that fortified property owners' rights against HOA overreach and required thorough environmental impact studies before altering any natural waterway. Law schools from Stanford to Harvard now include the Brennan Creek case as a textbook example of grassroots environmental enforcement. The $750,000 court award covered the entire creek restoration, paid all legal expenses, and left enough to create the William Brennan Environmental Engineering Scholarship at Colorado State University. The first recipient, Sarah Olivia, went on to graduate from law school and join the EPA's Enforcement Division, continuing the mission of holding environmental offenders accountable. Brenda's downfall after the courtroom drama felt almost uneventful by comparison. She pleaded guilty to federal fraud, serving 18 months in a minimum security prison, followed by 3 years of probation and full restitution to the HOA victims. Her real estate license was permanently revoked, her assets seized, and her family quietly relocated to Florida where they keep their Colorado chapter firmly in the past. The owner of the concrete company received a 2-year sentence and $2 million in environmental fines. 3 former HOA board members got probation and community service, restoring damaged waterways across the state on weekends. In the wake of the scandal, Edwin Kowalski was unanimously elected HOA president. He immediately introduced new bylaws requiring environmental review for any future projects. But the most profound change wasn't in policy, it was in the people. Willowbrook transformed from a closed-off enclave of wary neighbors into a real community. The annual Creek Festival now draws thousands, a living showcase of what ordinary citizens can achieve when they unite to protect something worth saving. Back in my workshop, I've returned to restoring vintage motorcycles and teaching local kids not just about engines, but about water flow, engineering, and the courage it takes to stand up to bullies. The walls are covered with thank you letters from homeowners across the country fighting similar battles, along with speaking invitations from environmental conferences. Martha returned to teaching, weaving watershed protection and civic activism into her curriculum. Her students' science fair projects on creek restoration have won regional competitions and attracted attention from university researchers studying community-driven environmental solutions. The Cottonwood Creek Redemption Project has since been replicated in dozens of towns where HOAs or developers damaged natural waterways. Federal agencies now use our case as a training example, showing how citizen action can achieve results that overworked government departments sometimes can't. Just last week, I took a call from a homeowner in Arizona facing almost the exact same story: concrete channeling, embezzled funds, and intimidation tactics. Hearing her speak, I knew this fight is bigger than one creek in Colorado. Martha and I have been talking about turning our workshop into a resource center for environmental self-defense, helping other communities fight back. For now, though, I'm content to sit on the back porch at sunset, listening to my grandfather's creek sing through the willows, while Martha reads letters from supporters around the country. Home isn't just a building, it's where your values stand strong and your community thrives. So here is my challenge to you. If you've got an HOA nightmare brewing in your neighborhood, share it. You might be surprised at how much power you actually have when someone tries to destroy something beautiful. And stick around because next week we're diving into the story of the HOA that tried to ban vegetable gardens, a broken bar, and the 73-year-old grandmother who fought back with the Constitution and won. Sometimes the best revenge against bullies is patience, preparation, and letting nature take back what was hers all along.